Welcome to this webinar, which is part of the first conference on European demography and social values, which in a project which has been set up by the Sonnenberg movement and joined by the University of Pardubice, the Czech Republic, the Bulgarian German Teachers Association, and the Danish Cultural Institute in Latvia, Estonia and Lithuania. This is a project with 8 conferences in 7 different countries, plus a website on which you will be able to find this webinar later on, which is called myeurope.today. myeurope.today. Now, here we are. We have been running a conference on these themes, European participatory democracy and social values since Monday. This is Friday today. And one of the things that where we ended up and which were extremely sort of interested in, created a lot of energy, was this: can we formulate a European dream? What is the European dream? And I would now like to introduce the panel which we have selected here, with participants sitting behind. Everybody can come up and ask questions, just like you can on the chat. Here we have Heidi Zuleger, who's a teacher, former teacher at the Pedagogical University in Vienna. Taya Kronberg, who's a former Minister of Labour in Finland and also a former member of the European Parliament for the Greens. And Stuart Sweeney from Great Britain, a dance critic. I would like to ask you, Taya, first. What can we say? Is there a European dream?
Well, I think maybe there should be a European dream. We need something to take us out of the crisis, to see what holds us together in the future. We see the Euro crisis, we see the crisis of the urban borders, and we can even fear that peace will not last. So I think definitely there's a place for a dream, an idea about the future. And I think you can compare with the American dream. The American dreams and the European dream are different. The one is individually oriented, maybe more material. Maybe the European dream is more collective and maybe more spiritual. But I think it would be good to look at the idea of a European dream today.
But you could say maybe in many ways Europe is falling apart right now. What would you like to say?
I had here a week where we were very hard working to think about solutions, to build up a new identity for Europe, and to know or to make know much more people than nowadays are doing about the values of Europe, and to find solutions going in common, and to increase the knowledge. I think we should have this dream, otherwise we couldn't realize.
But it seems to be falling apart.
Well, the old dream, I think we need a new dream.
Stuart?
Yes, so we have worked hard this week, but in some ways we are very much at the first stage, I think, and we have seen some of the problems. I think with this European dream, personally, I have always been attracted to the Nordic model, as you say, with collective support for the community, etc. But I know that not everyone in the UK shares that view, and somehow we must find a way to try and bring together the Northern European ideas, Southern European, and then of course the new democracies in Eastern and Central Europe. Well, we have 7 conferences, and perhaps towards the end we will find a way forward on this.
Yes, maybe I should have said that at the end of this series of conferences we will work out what we hope we can call My Europe Declaration, and that will take place in November next year at the conference in Germany. Taya, you wanted to...
I think one of the things that we have discussed is this European idea of united in difference. We cannot all be the same. We cannot all be Nordics. We have to understand the difference. And one of the basic messages was also that we have to understand each other's cultures and allow for the differences in regional cultures, regional traditions. And here I think it comes in that it's not a question of the Nordic model or somebody else's model, but it's a question of seeing how we can live together.
Yeah.
But I think it's very important to say that we need diversity instead of nationalism. Yes.
Yes. But is there so much of a dream that it can keep Europe together? Today, I would say that we have at least 5 or 6 crises at hand, right? We have a Ukraine-Russia crisis. We have a Greek crisis not solved. We have refugee, Mediterranean crisis. We have the Brits pulling out. That's also a sort of a crisis, isn't it?
Maybe.
And we have a lot of parties that now thrive from expressing their disagreement with the European dream.
But the tradition in Europe, if you see how Europe has evolved, it's not according to a plan. It's always because of a crisis. So since we have all this maximum number of crises, maybe we have the maximum possibility of actually through the crisis see where to go. What is the path forward?
Yes.
I think that fear makes weak, and we have to try to get strong
Exactly.
and to find new ideas.
And maybe we should look upon it in a positive way, in the sense that with the refugee crisis, if we didn't have the European Union, we would have no framework or very weak frameworks to actually tackle the problem. But as it is, we do have a strong framework in place which can at least start to engage with this problem and perhaps find a way forward. It would be much more difficult without the European Union, and the refugees would be in a terrible position.
I think this applies to many problems, that you have to have common solutions in today's world. So the refugee crisis is one, trade and cooperation is another, diplomatic solutions, for example, to the Iran crisis are a third. So there are a lot of things that where you need cooperative solutions, cooperative security.
Yes.
And so in this sense, if Europe falls apart or becomes just an internal market again, it's not enough.
One of the people who are joining us here is Klaus Jenner, former chairman of the Sonnenberg movement, who says, can the Sonnenberg movement take an active part in solving the refugee issue?
I think it's interesting. We've had some discussions that perhaps Sonnenberg House, which has a strong tradition of anti-fascism and human rights work and work with minorities, is perhaps in an ideal place to actually work with the local government in Lower Saxony to take an important role in tackling what Lower Saxony will be doing in respect to the refugees. And I think that could be very valuable.
I think the problem now is I don't think there's one solution to the refugee crisis, so we cannot seek one solution, but what would be necessary would be that there are sort of two lines. One is the no refugees, we have a system, we have an asylum system from the top down, and then there's the people who actually want to help and want to do something. And so I think one would need a bridge between these two approaches.
But is this where we have the European dream, that the Europeans think about themselves as people who have a humanitarian obligation and who feels open to human values and universal human values. This is actually what Angela Merkel talked about.
But I think in Europe we have the point to show that we have understood all these ideas, that we be companions, that we help each other, because for one state it isn't possible to solve.
I can tell you that here at the chat we have at least 2 people saying that we're talking too much about crisis. We should talk more about solutions. Well, okay. What do you think about that?
Well, I think the question is that, of course, we have to talk about solutions, and the discussion about what is it to be a European, what is the European dream, and where do we want to go from here is the way to solutions. I think very quick solutions in this situation will probably fail, but just creating a process where we find where to go.
Could we, if we are to find solutions, and what we have been talking about here is not finding solutions for tomorrow or for the next election, but for a much more long-term. We are talking about more long-term perspectives. Is the idea of a more participatory approach to European politics, involving more people, having more discussions before things are decided in Brussels, is that part of the solution?
I think going together with the new media, it is part of involving more people and make the bottom-up movement.
So you think that the new digital media, the Facebook and Twitter, etc., could be part of a positive, participatory, democratic development?
I'm sure it could.
Yes, we have asked the audience to come in and sit here if they have questions, and right now we have Finn coming in. Please, Finn, over.
Yes, about the solution. I think that the refugee crisis has maybe shown a way. I think some of the problem in Europe today is that the politicians are afraid of their voters. They don't know where their voters are, and they have been very afraid to make too many decisions in the area of the refugees. But now, a lot of people in Europe shows that they are not so afraid as the politicians. They show that they, in 60% of the Danish populations, think we can have more refugees as the government thinks. And you see the same in a lot of European countries. So we have to find solutions where the population can show what they want to the politicians.
One of the things we've also been discussing is how to increase democracy within the various European Union structures. And I think the one that we have come back to several times is the European Parliament. And certainly the European Parliament has a lot more power now than it once did, and a lot more influence. But really we think that this would be, we're looking for more strengthening of this, of the European Parliament, perhaps with greater interaction with national parliaments on the one hand, but also maybe we need to look at moving some of the powers from the Commission to the Parliament to actually instigate legislation. We have heard about some of the reports which can be made from the Parliament to the Commission asking for legislation. It would be good to see more in that direction.
I think as the importance of the Parliament increases, then also the interest to vote in the European elections would be higher. People would feel that it matters. Until now, the Parliament has been sort of marginalized in decision making. So if the Parliament actually gets the right to initiative, if it has much more to say, like now in the economy questions, then I think people feel that this is a matter that concerns everybody. I think the Euro crisis, if you want to find a positive thing about it, is that it has actually made people aware that Europe matters, and things that are being discussed are a problem also for you.
Yes. There are people who say that Europe cannot move unless you have a crisis, and that you have to have a crisis for things to move on, and then they'll move on 2 steps and walk back 1 step. But I'm thinking this discontent with Europe, could that have to do with people feeling that Europe doesn't take care of them in the sense that they would like or doesn't respect them sufficiently. What I hear at the conference, one group said that European benefits are sort of thinly spread, that we gain a little here, a little there, a little there, and little lower prices, etc., etc. But the pain that comes from globalization and Europeanization is often felt in specific areas and specific industries and specific people. Isn't that, could that be the reason why Europe has not, could one say that Europe has not thought sufficiently about the social aspects of change?
I think the problem is that the social aspects of change have, one has said that it's a national matter, that the social aspects about poverty, about social security, it's a national governments that take care of that. I think in that sense, what Europe has been looking for is trade and markets and so forth, and banking system, and all this is of course very technical and not so close to people than the social security benefits. So there's already a problem that the question is, should the European Union take more responsibility for social questions?
What do you think here?
I think it should occur that the European community goes together and tries to find the solutions in common. And maybe if more people speak about, if more people ask for responsibility, politicians do that.
I think it would be a good idea because, but it is a question of national politics. You have to go to your the national politicians so that they can go to Brussels and give their votes there and to deliver more power to Brussels. But the problem is that the local or the national politicians are not so very open about EU because they will not show that they are not in power of all questions because something are decided in the EU. It's a big problem that the national parliaments don't discuss or only use very small time to discuss European matters.
Can I just say, I'm not convinced that moving into the social welfare field is a good idea at this time. I think certainly in the UK, the feeling is really we have sufficient powers have been given away to the European Union, and I think there would be almost across the board a reluctance for more, and perhaps, if anything, perhaps the other way round. And I think there are very great differences between the different countries. So I think we need to be very careful. There was once a European Union conference looking at harmonizing the legal systems. Okay, this will not happen. Okay, the UK system is completely different. There is no way it could be harmonized. So I think that we have to tread carefully on this, and perhaps one of the things is to put across the positive things that come from the EU. The media, certainly, in terms of its presentation of the EU, is usually negative or neutral, and this has conditioned populations, perhaps, to look rather askance at EU and what it can do.
But I think the basic question, I agree with you in the sense that we cannot talk about the common pension system today, or we cannot talk about the common unemployment system. Although I think that the youth unemployment that has been the consequence of the Euro crisis is partly a result of EU actions. So in this sense, one could say that, well, youth unemployment has to be solved on the European level. But I think the lack here is that we lack confidence. For example, the countries lack confidence in each other, and this is very typical in the foreign policy field. The Syrian crisis, the European Union has been practically handicapped in taking any initiatives in this because the countries don't agree, and then the United Nations don't agree. So we are in a situation where the refugee crisis is a result of the inactivity of the European Union
yes.
in actually doing something to hinder the crisis.
Yeah. There's a question here on the chat. Nils Christian Skips Andersen from Latvia asks, isn't it difficult to involve the EU in social policies when the direct public participation in the EU is as low as it is at the moment? So, which is what is the hen and what is the egg here? How do we, if people are discontent because they are not feeling that their worries are taken care of in the EU, then you have a lower. On the other hand, can you set up social policies at EU level when the participation is so low? How do we get out of this egg and hen question?
I think we should try.
You think we should try?
Yeah. Otherwise, you never know.
You're right.
Stuart?
I think the questioner has hit the nail on the head. I think it is we need to try to get the people more behind the European project as we have it at the moment, and look for ways to do that, perhaps before we go into new territory, which may build up even more alienation. But it really it is a problem in many of the countries to get engagement. We do not have control of the media, and that's a good thing. But how can we build up these relationships? We have 7 more conferences. Perhaps we will come up with some good ideas.
I think one of the things I found when in the European Parliament, you have the right as a member to take in guests from your country. Mm-hmm. And I think every time I had a group of guests, there was always this enthusiasm afterwards, and people said, well, now I know how the Parliament functions, and now I know what kind of questions you are dealing with, and I think if you could get the 500 million people to visit the European Parliament, it could probably give an idea for the people. What does the Parliament do? Because otherwise, EU is seen as a bureaucratic mastodon in Brussels with 30,000 employees that don't care about the ordinary person.
But do you think that the member of the parliament are doing enough in their own countries to tell about? Because in Denmark, I think it's very. I know 1 or 2 of the 7 parliament members. I think it's very seldom you hear from them.
I think this is, of course, true that parliamentarians often take in their own constituencies and talk about things, make things known, but it's a problem.
Stuart mentioned about the 7 conferences to come, so that it'll be a total of 8. And of course, we have to say that have been preparing, and you will find that on the website myeurope.today. You'll be able to find some of the considerations and the ideas, the questions that have come up here. We have arrived at the conclusion that we cannot make conclusions as such. We can put questions, and we can try to indicate where we think that we could find elements of an answer, and then we will relay this to the next conference, and you will find everything on the web. But we'll relay it to the next conference, which will relay further down the line until we end up in November 11 in Germany. But we have to, winding up here, I would like to ask you, what were the most important things you gathered or discovered here during the conference here in Allinge? Shall we start with you, Stuart?
Well, I was very encouraged by what we heard this morning about the process for the TTIP and
TTIP, you have to explain.
You can. So the initials stand for. Remind me again. It's
a transatlantic trade and investment partnership, which is
being
being negotiated right now.
And there is a great deal of concern, and friends of mine have signed a petition in the UK that this is a secret agreement which will be imposed, and we will know nothing about it, and it could erode the rights of workers, and companies could sue governments if they introduce legislation. There has really been a lot of concern about this. I was encouraged today to hear that the Parliament, the EU Parliament, is involved in these discussions and is making input. And then both before and after the meetings that take place, they are having discussions and drawing lines in the sand to say, no, we will not allow this. So that was very encouraging for me.
Do you think that is a kind of or that points towards the kind of participatory democracy which you are asking for, or would you ask for more?
It's a step on the way, and perhaps I would actually. The European Union Parliament is not directly involved. It is the Commission who is doing the negotiating. I would prefer that it was the Parliament that was actually directly involved. But it's a step on the way, and I think I will certainly be telling some of my friends in the UK that perhaps the situation is not as bad and as secret as they thought.
Talia, what did you gather from that?
I think maybe we are always used to thinking that the European values are the guideline, and that we have values that we share together, and that this will give us the way forward. I think my experience from this meeting is that these values have to be discussed on a different level, that you have to be more concrete. And we have talked about peace as a principle, and it's important and it's concrete. But when you talk only about human rights, you sort of are in a sphere which is not so concrete. So you have to come and say, well, what are the values that in my life are the guiding ones, and then
does it
find
mean
out.
Closer to people's lives, you mean, or do you mean more sort of concrete political
I
initiatives?
think when we talk about rule of law and democracy and human rights, then we maybe have to talk about what can we do for the Parliament to have more to say, or how we can combine the national and the European parliaments. Talk on a level where you actually feel that there's some action.
I think
Heidi?
it is necessary that every European is thinking about himself. What does it mean to me? And if much more people than nowadays think about, they will act, and they should act.
I think it's so important that we have got so many facts, real facts, and that is one thing we should look at in the future too. Where we have a crisis maybe with the journalists, then we have to find other ways that everybody is discussing on the same ground, so that we know that the facts are the facts.
We need more facts.
More facts and more real facts.
Shall we try to put some of these facts on the My Europe Today website?
I think so. We should do that.
Yes.
And one other thing, I think it has been fantastic how engaged all the people here are or have been. One participant came and told me that the discussions here have changed her view on EU totally. Mm. I think that's interesting.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think we should wind up here and say thank you to those who followed us on the web. The next webinar will be from Latvia, we hope. It will be in December, but you will be able to find more information on the myeurope.today website, where you will also find some blogs and ideas, and where we also ask you to think of, can you take part as a volunteer in one sort of aspect of this project? Maybe as somebody who does practical things, maybe as somebody who writes and reports or make entries into the blog, maybe as somebody who takes photographs. We'll be very happy if you would take part in this project, which we think is extremely important for the future of us all, for the future of Europe.